Electricity doesn't argue, doesn't compromise, and absolutely does not care how many YouTube tutorials you watched before breakfast. It doesn't care if you're handy. It doesn't care if you've done this before. And it definitely doesn't care if your wife is watching and you desperately need to look like the kind of man who understands wires. Today, we're looking at 10 people who made the same deeply human mistake. They saw electricity and assumed confidence counted as insulation. This is not a magic force. It's not mysterious. It's just physics with a body count. The people in this video weren't unlucky. They were aggressively, spectacularly wrong. They touched what they shouldn't have touched, opened what they shouldn't have opened, and treated warning signs like decorative suggestions for weaker men. So consider this a public safety announcement wrapped in dark comedy. These are real decisions, real volts, real consequences. And if at any point during this video you think, honestly, I could probably handle that better, congratulations, you may already be halfway into the first chapter. Let's begin with a man from Pennsylvania who wanted to make art with 2,000 volts and accidentally added himself to the design. Case 1. The fractal wood-burning genius. The internet has given humanity many incredible gifts: instant communication, unlimited knowledge, and thousands of videos showing people doing extremely dangerous things in their garage while calm background music plays, which has created a very specific problem. Millions of viewers watch those videos and think, honestly, I could do that. Enter Gerald. Gerald was a 43-year-old hobbyist from rural Pennsylvania whose entire personality could be summarized as, watched too many DIY videos and developed a mild God complex. One night, while scrolling online, he discovered a craft called fractal wood burning. If you've never seen it before, it's actually beautiful. High-voltage electricity is sent through a damp wooden board, creating lightning-like burn patterns called Lichtenberg figures. The results look like tiny electric storms trapped inside the wood. The process, however, requires something extremely important: electricity strong enough to kill you instantly. Specifically, most people who attempt this hobby build a device using a microwave oven transformer, also known as an MOT. A normal household outlet delivers about 120 volts. An MOT boosts that to roughly 2,000 volts. To put that in perspective, around 100 milliamps of current can stop a human heart. An MOT can deliver several amps, which is less small electrical hobby tool and more portable lightning launcher. But Gerald had seen the videos, people online were doing it, and in Gerald's mind, safety warnings were just the cautious ramblings of people who lacked vision. To be fair, Gerald didn't begin as a complete idiot. His first few projects were done carefully: rubber gloves, one hand behind his back, respectful distance from anything conductive. He treated the electricity with caution, which is exactly where things started to go wrong. Because surviving dangerous activities has a strange psychological side effect. Your brain begins whispering dangerous little lies like, "You're basically an expert now. The rules are mostly for beginners." By project number 5, Gerald had decided the safety equipment was slowing down his artistic process. And that sentence has historically appeared just moments before roughly 10,000 preventable deaths. On the night Gerald permanently retired from the gene pool, he was live-streaming his latest project to an audience of 14 people. Yes, this man was working with 2,000 volts of electricity for an audience smaller than most book clubs. The oak slab he was working on wasn't cooperating with his artistic vision. The fractal pattern was spreading unevenly, which Gerald took personally, so he decided to reposition the electrodes. Now a person with even the most basic survival instincts would do one small thing before adjusting electrical clamps connected to a 2,000-volt transformer. They would unplug the machine. Gerald, however, had apparently traded his survival instincts for confidence somewhere around project number 3. So he reached over to adjust the metal clamp while the transformer was still humming beside him. His left hand grabbed the electrode. At the exact moment his right elbow brushed the grounded metal frame of his workbench. And suddenly, electricity found exactly what it had been looking for: a perfect path of least resistance. 2,000 volts traveled from one electrode, through Gerald's arm, across his chest, directly through his heart, and into the grounded workbench. The entire journey took less time than it takes your brain to form the thought, maybe I should have unplugged this first. The current triggered ventricular fibrillation, which is the medical term for when the heart starts moving like it's breakdancing instead of pumping blood. Gerald's body locked up, then collapsed face first onto the wooden slab he had been decorating. Meanwhile, his live stream kept running. At first, his 14 viewers thought this was part of the demonstration. Then the seconds started passing. Then minutes. The stream continued broadcasting Gerald lying motionless for nearly 6 minutes before someone finally called emergency services. When paramedics arrived, the transformer was still humming quietly beside him. Completely calm. Completely indifferent. Electricity had done exactly what electricity always does. It followed the path. And Gerald had generously volunteered to be it. In a final twist of irony that feels almost scripted, the oak slab he died on had developed an absolutely beautiful fractal burn pattern, along with one additional burn mark, roughly shaped like a human forearm, which, if you look at it the right way, could be considered Gerald's final artistic contribution. Case 2. The generator suicide cord. Power outages reveal a lot about people. Some people light candles, grab blankets, and wait for the electricity to come back like normal adults. Others see a blackout and think, finally, my moment to demonstrate absolute masculine competence. Earl was one of those men. At 51 years old, living in suburban Texas, Earl owned 3 things he considered proof of his self-reliance: a pickup truck, a portable generator, and roughly 300 hours of YouTube tutorials. Unfortunately, he owned 0 hours of actual electrical training. One stormy evening, a thunderstorm knocked out power across his entire neighborhood. Lights went out. Air conditioners died. The street went dark. Most people accepted the situation and waited for the utility company. Earl saw an opportunity, his moment to prove to his wife, his neighbors, and possibly the entire power grid that he was the kind of man who didn't need electricians. Because electricians, in Earl's mind, were just guys who liked charging money for things he could obviously figure out himself. Now, the correct way to connect a generator to your home is by installing something called a transfer switch. A transfer switch safely routes generator power into your electrical panel without sending electricity back into the grid. It costs about $300 and takes a professional electrician maybe 2 hours. Earl considered that option briefly, then immediately rejected it. Because paying someone else to do something is what Earl called quitting. Instead, he built what electricians refer to as a suicide cord. And yes, that is the real name. A suicide cord is a cable with 2 male plugs. One end goes into the generator. The other end goes into a household outlet. It's designed to backfeed power through the house wiring. It's also designed, either intentionally or accidentally, to create the maximum possible opportunity for electrocution. Here's why. When one end is plugged into the generator, the other plug has fully energized metal prongs sticking out in the open air. Those prongs are carrying enough electricity to stop a human heart instantly. But Earl had seen the tutorials. He knew exactly what he was doing, which is a phrase that has historically preceded many extremely educational funerals. That night, Earl rolled his generator into the garage, pulled the starter cord. The machine roared to life. He plugged one end of the cable into the generator, then picked up the other end and walked toward the kitchen outlet like a man carrying a sandwich. And here is where Earl made the tiny decision that separated him from continuing his life. Instead of holding the plug by the insulated plastic handle, he grabbed it by the metal prongs, because he wanted to guide it more precisely into the outlet. The moment his fingers touched those energized prongs, 240 volts and 30 amps of current entered his hand, and electricity immediately found the perfect exit route, through his chest, across his heart, and down through his legs into the concrete garage floor. His heart stopped instantly, his muscles locked up, and Earl collapsed onto the ground, still holding the plug in a grip so tight that emergency responders later needed tools to remove it. Inside the house, his wife sat quietly in the dark living room, waiting for the lights to turn on. Instead, she heard a heavy thump from the garage, followed by the generator continuing to hum cheerfully, completely unaware that its operator had just completed his final electrical project. The coroner listed the cause of death as accidental electrocution, but the story can be summarized with much simpler math. Transfer switch installation, $300. Funeral costs, $12,000. The price of learning that electrical codes exist for a reason. Everything else. Case 3. The train roof influencer. Every generation produces a certain type of young man. The kind who looks at danger and thinks, yes, but imagine the views. Alexei was 22 years old and living on the outskirts of Moscow. His entire online identity revolved around a hobby known as roof-topping, climbing extremely tall structures without safety equipment and filming the experience for social media. Radio towers, construction cranes, abandoned buildings. If it was tall, illegal, and capable of ending his life instantly, Alexei had probably already climbed it. His followers loved it, partly because it looked impressive, but mostly because people on the internet possess a deeply human curiosity about watching someone else flirt with natural selection. For a while, Alexei had been very successful. He climbed higher, took bigger risks, gained more followers. But eventually, normal buildings started to feel boring. After all, buildings just sit there. They don't move. They don't add extra difficulty. Which is when Alexei discovered something far more exciting: train surfing. Specifically, riding on the roof of commuter trains as they travel through the city. Now, train surfing already comes with several obvious problems. The train moves extremely fast. The roof is smooth metal. There are no handles. Falling off results in immediate consequences. But there was an even bigger problem Alexei hadn't fully researched: the power lines above the train. Russian commuter trains run on roughly 27,000 volts of electricity delivered through overhead wires. To put that in perspective, a normal wall outlet might give you 220 volts. 27,000 volts is over 100 times stronger, which means electricity at that level behaves a little differently. At very high voltage, electricity doesn't always wait for physical contact. Sometimes it just jumps through the air. This is called an arc flash, and depending on conditions, that arc can leap through half a meter of empty space looking for a path to ground. In other words, you don't have to touch the wire, you just have to get too close. But Alexei's electrical research had apparently stopped at the part where people shouted, "Don't touch the wires!" So one morning he climbed onto the roof of a commuter train with his phone mounted to a selfie stick. The plan was simple: stand near the pantograph, the device connecting the train to the overhead power line, spread his arms, film the moment, and show the internet how fearless he was. The train began accelerating, wind rushing past, city buildings sliding by below. Alexei stood up proudly on the roof, about 40 centimeters from the power connection, arms spread wide in triumph. For a brief moment, he looked like he had conquered the system, king of the skyline, master of gravity, champion of internet clout. Then physics arrived. 27,000 volts found his raised hand. The arc flash was visible to passengers several cars away, a blinding blue-white explosion. The current jumped from the power line to Alexei's fingertips, traveled through his body, and exited into the grounded metal roof beneath him. Cardiac arrest was instantaneous. So were the severe burns. The train continued its journey for another 4 kilometers before reaching the next station. By the time workers climbed onto the roof to investigate the flash passengers had reported, the story was already over. In one final twist of internet-age irony, Alexei's phone survived. The video automatically uploaded to cloud storage. It shows the bright flash, a brief silhouette, then the quiet Russian countryside rolling past. While his body lies motionless on the roof, he had finally created the viral video he wanted. It just didn't include him watching it. Case 4. The tape measure arc flash. There is a very specific type of man who watches a professional do something complicated and immediately thinks, honestly, that doesn't look that hard. Dennis was a 47-year-old garage renovator from suburban Ohio who had recently decided to transform his garage into a dream workshop. New shelves, new lighting, brand new workbench. All very reasonable goals. The problem began when Dennis needed to measure the space near his electrical panel. A normal person would stand outside the panel door, measure the wall, and continue living their life. Definition decided he needed the exact interior measurement, which required opening the panel while it was still fully energized. Now, for people unfamiliar with what lives inside an electrical panel, here's the short version. It's a metal box filled with high-current bus bars, multiple circuit breakers, thick power cables, and roughly 200 amps of electricity feeding your entire house. In other words, a place where metal tools should behave themselves. Dennis grabbed his trusty 25-foot metal tape measure, the rigid steel kind that extends out in a long curved blade. Excellent for measuring walls, catastrophic for measuring things inside live electrical panels. But Dennis leaned in and extended the tape anyway, squinting at the numbers while completely ignoring the quiet hum of electricity inches from his face. As the tape extended further into the panel, gravity did what gravity always does. The metal blade began to bow slightly downward, and in a moment of absolutely perfect bad luck, the curved metal blade touched both bus bars at once. One bar carried one phase of electricity, the other carried the second phase, and when the tape measure connected them, Dennis accidentally created a short circuit powerful enough to start a small sun. What happened next is called an arc flash. An arc flash is not a simple spark. It is a violent electrical explosion that can reach temperatures of roughly 35,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For comparison, the surface of the sun is about 10,000 degrees, which means Dennis had just created something roughly 3 times hotter than the sun directly in front of his face. The copper in the tape measure vaporized instantly. Molten metal sprayed outward. A basketball-sized fireball of plasma erupted from the panel, and the blast threw Dennis backward across the garage floor. Neighbors later reported hearing a loud boom, followed by silence. Inside the house, Dennis's wife was watching television when the explosion shook the walls. She walked into the garage moments later and found him lying on the floor beside the destroyed electrical panel. The tape measure had fused into a melted lump of copper and plastic, still clutched in what remained of his right hand. The main breaker eventually tripped, but it took about 3 seconds, which is 3 seconds longer than Dennis needed to survive. The paramedics who arrived didn't attempt resuscitation. At the temperatures involved in an arc flash, there is usually very little left to work with. The fire department later used the scene in a training presentation titled, "Why We Hire Licensed Electricians." And in one final, quietly cruel detail, Dennis had opened the panel to measure space for a woodworking bench, a hobby that, under normal circumstances, involves wood chips, not plasma explosions hotter than the surface of the sun. Case 5. The concrete block mechanic. Every neighborhood has that guy. The guy who believes 3 things with absolute conviction. Safety equipment is for cowards. Manuals are just suggestions. Spending $30 at a hardware store is basically financial betrayal. In this particular story, that guy's name was Carl. Carl owned a massive 3/4-ton pickup truck, the kind designed to tow boats, trailers, and occasionally small houses, which means the truck weighed roughly 6,000 pounds, about the same as 2 adult rhinoceroses stacked together. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Carl decided he was going to fix a transmission leak. Now, any mechanic, professional or amateur, will tell you there is one non-negotiable rule when working under a vehicle. You must support the vehicle with jack stands. Heavy steel supports specifically designed to hold thousands of pounds safely. You can buy a perfectly good pair for around $30 to $40. Carl, however, believed this was a scam invented by Big Tool, so he looked around his yard for an alternative, and his eyes landed on 2 objects sitting beside his wife's vegetable garden: cinder blocks. Now, to be fair, cinder blocks can hold a lot of weight, but only under very specific conditions. The weight must be evenly distributed. The block must sit on solid ground. The block must remain perfectly upright. Carl ignored all 3, because Carl placed the blocks on wet soil after a morning rain, then used a cheap hydraulic jack to lift his truck into the air. He slid the hollow concrete blocks under the frame rails. The moment the jack lowered, the entire 6,000-pound truck rested on 2 brittle masonry bricks that were never designed for that kind of pressure. One of the blocks immediately began to sink slightly into the mud. The other tilted at a mild angle. There was even an audible cracking sound. Most people would hear that sound and think, maybe I should rethink my life choices. Carl heard it and thought, looks solid. He rolled his mechanic's creeper underneath the truck and slid into position beneath the transmission. At this point, Carl was lying in what engineers refer to as the crush zone, the small space between several tons of steel above and the ground below. He reached up to loosen a bolt, and that's when physics quietly decided the experiment had gone on long enough. The uneven pressure caused the left block to crack first. Concrete does not fail slowly, it fails instantly. The hollow structure shattered into powder, which immediately shifted the truck's full weight onto the second block. The second block lasted about half a second. Then it exploded into fragments as well. With nothing left supporting the vehicle, gravity stepped in. The 6,000-pound truck dropped straight down. There was no time to crawl away. No time to shout. No time to reconsider the $30 he had refused to spend. The impact crushed the space beneath the vehicle instantly. Carl never finished loosening the bolt. Neighbors later discovered the truck sitting flat on the wet soil, rain lightly tapping against the metal hood. When emergency crews finally lifted the vehicle using proper hydraulic equipment, they found Carl still lying on the creeper board, exactly where he had started working. A tragic reminder of a simple mathematical truth. You can save $30 on tools, but gravity always collects the full bill. Case 6. The Industrial Clothesline. There is a certain breed of suburban dad who treats every household task like a military engineering contract. Fix a squeaky door? No. Replace the hinges with reinforced steel. Install 3 extra bolts. Add weather sealing rated for hurricanes. Because in their mind, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing to an absolutely ridiculous degree. Our next candidate, Richard, fell squarely into this category. His wife had asked him to install a simple clothesline in the backyard. Just something basic. 2 posts, some rope, hang the laundry, done. A perfectly normal solution would have been cotton rope or nylon line. Cost? About $12. Installation time? 15 minutes. But Richard was not interested in normal solutions. Richard was interested in maximum strength. So instead of rope, he went to the garage and found something he considered much more appropriate. A thick coil of industrial steel winch cable, the kind tow trucks use to pull cars out of ditches. This cable was designed to handle several tons of tension, which is useful when dragging a pickup truck up a mountain, slightly less necessary when drying bath towels. But Richard was committed. He anchored one end of the cable to a large oak tree, then stretched it across the yard to a maple tree. But the real masterpiece was what he installed on the second tree, a ratcheting hand winch, a mechanical tensioning device that allows you to tighten a steel cable with extreme force, normally used for vehicle recovery, heavy machinery, industrial rigging. Richard attached the cable and began cranking the handle. Click, click, click. Each pull tightened the cable further. The steel line grew straighter and straighter across the yard, until it was pulled so tight that it began producing a faint metallic hum in the breeze. At this point, the 2 trees themselves had begun to bend slightly toward each other. The steel cable was under enormous tension. But Richard stepped back, wiped sweat from his forehead, and studied the line critically. It wasn't perfect. There was still a tiny amount of sag. And in Richard's world, tiny sag was unacceptable. So he grabbed the winch handle again and leaned his full body weight into one final crank. Click. The cable stretched further. The trees bowed inward another inch. And then the steel finally reached its breaking point. Metal under tension does not gently snap like rope. It explodes. The cable failed with a deafening crack that echoed across the backyard. And in a fraction of a second, the 2 broken ends whipped backward through the air with enormous speed. A steel cable under that much tension behaves like a giant razor whip. And, unfortunately for Richard, he was standing directly in the path of the recoil. The cable lashed across his neck with devastating force. The injury was immediate and catastrophic. Neighbors later reported hearing the snap, but assumed it was just a tree branch breaking. By the time emergency services arrived, the backyard had gone quiet again. The broken cable hung loosely between the trees, still attached to the winch, still technically functioning as a clothesline, just not one anyone would ever use. Investigators later estimated that the cable had been under several thousand pounds of tension when it failed, enough stored energy to launch a motorcycle, which makes one detail of the entire situation particularly tragic. Richard had built the most over-engineered clothesline in suburban history, a structure strong enough to tow a truck, powerful enough to bend trees, and capable of killing the one person it was supposed to help. All because someone looked at a pile of wet laundry and decided it needed industrial-grade physics. Case 7. The Sleepy Steel Worker. Most people who work night shifts develop a few survival habits. Coffee, energy drinks, maybe pacing around the building at 3 a.m. so their brain doesn't shut off mid-sentence. But every now and then you meet a person who thinks the best solution to night shift exhaustion is simply finding a place to nap. Our next Darwin Award candidate worked the overnight shift at a German steel foundry, a place where molten metal moves around in giant buckets like lava in a science documentary. Not exactly the safest environment for an unscheduled power nap. His job was relatively simple: monitor equipment, make sure the production line kept running, try not to fall into anything glowing. But after several weeks of long shifts, our hero developed a very creative coping strategy. He started looking for places in the factory where supervisors wouldn't find him: dark corners, storage rooms, maintenance areas, anywhere he could close his eyes for a few minutes. One night, wandering through the plant at around 3:40 a.m., he discovered something that looked absolutely perfect: a giant steel ladle. Now, if you've never seen one before, a ladle in a steel mill is basically a massive metal bucket the size of a small car. Its job is to hold molten slag and liquid metal at temperatures hotter than lava. But at this particular moment, the ladle was empty. It had just been moved into a maintenance bay. Cold, dark, quiet. To a sleep-deprived brain, the inside of that ladle looked like the world's most comfortable metal hammock. He climbed inside, curled up at the bottom, and fell asleep almost immediately. Now, here's the important part. Right next to the ladle was a large electronic sign, bright red letters, flashing warning lights. The sign explained that the ladle was scheduled for an automated thermal cleaning cycle at 4 a.m. This is a standard process in steel plants. When a ladle finishes transporting molten metal, it must be cleaned. So robotic burners swing into position and blast the interior with superheated flames to burn away residue. Temperatures during this process can reach 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt metal. But our exhausted steelworker saw the sign and thought something like, "No problem, I'll wake up before then." Because apparently he believed his internal biological clock was more reliable than German industrial automation. He checked his watch. 3:45 a.m. Plenty of time. Just a quick nap. 5 minutes. Maybe 10. He closed his eyes and instantly entered the deepest sleep of his life. Meanwhile, the factory's automated systems continued their quiet mechanical routine. Machines moving, sensors checking temperatures, robotic arms positioning equipment. At exactly 4 a.m., the cleaning cycle began. The heavy burner assembly swung slowly into position above the ladle, and with perfect German precision, a roaring column of superheated flame blasted downward into the bucket. The system was designed to incinerate hardened metal deposits. Organic material did not stand a chance. Workers arriving for the morning shift noticed nothing unusual. The cleaning cycle completed exactly as scheduled. The ladle looked spotless, perfectly sanitized. But when technicians inspected the bottom of the bucket later that morning, they found something unexpected: a small pile of ash and charred residue that absolutely had not been there the day before. The internal investigation later concluded the man had likely fallen asleep around 3:50 a.m. and never woke up. A tragic reminder of two important workplace lessons: never nap inside industrial equipment, and perhaps even more importantly, German factory automation runs on time. Every single time. Case 8. The Tornado Gladiator. Every tornado season, meteorologists say the same thing: take shelter immediately. Go to the basement. Stay away from windows. It's a very simple survival plan. Yet somehow, every year, there is at least one guy who hears those instructions and thinks, or I could fight it. Our next Darwin Award nominee lived in rural Kansas, a place where tornadoes are about as common as pickup trucks and barbecue grills. Most residents understand the rules. When the sky turns green and the sirens start screaming, you grab your family and head underground. But not this guy. He had spent years mocking what he called basement cowards. According to him, hiding from a tornado was a sign of weakness. Real men stood their ground, which eventually led him to develop the single most ridiculous storm survival strategy ever attempted. He built what he proudly called an anti-tornado suit. The design was ambitious. First, he wrapped himself in 4 layers of memory foam mattresses, the same foam used in comfortable beds. Apparently, his theory was that tornado debris would simply bounce off the soft padding like tennis balls. Next, he strapped the entire structure together using cargo straps and duct tape, dozens of layers. He looked less like a storm fighter and more like a walking sofa. Then, he added a motorcycle helmet for extra protection. But the real masterpiece of engineering was the anchoring system, because even he realized tornadoes tend to lift things into the air. So, he tied a heavy climbing rope around his padded torso and secured the other end to a massive oak tree in his yard. Now, to be fair, the oak tree had survived decades of storms. It seems sturdy, but there's a difference between surviving wind and being used as the anchor point for a human mattress burrito. One spring afternoon, the tornado sirens finally went off. A large funnel cloud had formed just outside town. Neighbors rushed to their basements. Families hid in storm shelters. And our heavily padded warrior marched proudly into his front yard. He tied himself to the tree, spread his arms dramatically, and waited. When the tornado arrived, the wind speed exceeded 150 miles per hour. Roofs lifted, trees snapped, entire barns disintegrated, and surprisingly, for about 10 seconds, his plan actually seemed to work. The rope held. The tree remained upright. The foam padding absorbed small flying debris like twigs and gravel. He reportedly began laughing and shouting into the wind, convinced he had outsmarted nature itself. But there was one tiny flaw in his calculations. He had focused entirely on wind resistance. What he had not considered was flying structures. Because tornadoes don't just throw around small objects. They pick up entire buildings. And as the vortex ripped through his property, something very large entered the rotating debris cloud. A section of steel roof truss from his own house. The tornado launched the beam like a javelin. It shot horizontally through the storm at over 100 miles per hour, and it struck our padded hero square in the torso. The foam mattresses were extremely effective at stopping pebbles. They were slightly less effective against flying construction materials. The impact was immediate. The rope remained tied to the tree. The foam armor remained intact, but the man inside it did not. When emergency crews arrived after the storm passed, they found him, still attached to the oak tree, wrapped in duct tape and mattresses, like the world's saddest couch cushion. Meanwhile, the steel beam that ended the experiment had originally come from the roof he refused to hide under, which is perhaps the universe's most poetic way of saying, sometimes the house wins. Case 9. The Open Concept Engineer. There are 2 types of people who renovate houses. The first type hires professionals, architects, engineers, contractors who understand words like load distribution and structural integrity. The second type watches 3 episodes of HGTV and suddenly believes they have unlocked the secrets of architecture. Our next Darwin Award candidate proudly belonged to the second group. His name was Victor, and Victor had recently purchased a second-floor condo in a concrete apartment building. It wasn't a bad place. Decent kitchen, nice windows, but there was one thing Victor absolutely hated. Right in the middle of the living room stood a thick, reinforced concrete pillar. A big one. Ugly. Immovable. And according to Victor's new interior design vision, it completely ruined the space. He had recently fallen in love with the idea of an open-concept living room. No walls, no obstacles. Just a wide, flowing area where guests could mingle freely. And this pillar was standing directly in the way of that dream. Now, most people confronted with a giant concrete support column in a multi-story building would have a very logical thought. That's probably important. Victor had a different thought. Why would someone put a pillar in the middle of the room? That makes no sense. And with that, Victor decided the pillar had to go. He did not call an engineer. He did not check building plans. He did not consult the homeowners association. Because in Victor's mind, this was simply a matter of breaking concrete until the room looked better. So he grabbed a 12-pound sledgehammer, put on a pair of cheap safety glasses, and began swinging. Concrete dust filled the air as he smashed chunks out of the column. Each impact echoed through the apartment, down the hallway, even into neighboring units. After about 20 minutes, Victor had chipped away enough concrete to expose something inside the pillar. Reinforced steel rebar, long metal rods embedded in the concrete. Now this was actually a major clue, because rebar inside a pillar usually means one thing: the pillar is holding something up. But Victor saw the steel rods and interpreted them as simply more things to remove. So he grabbed a hacksaw and began cutting through them. Meanwhile, the building itself started reacting. The ceiling above him began making deep groaning sounds. Hairline cracks spread across the drywall like spiderwebs. Plaster dust started drifting down from the floor above. These were not subtle warnings. They were basically the building screaming, "Please stop doing that." Victor ignored them all. He continued hammering, breaking concrete, cutting steel, until eventually he reached the final section of the column, the last chunk still connecting the floor to the ceiling. Victor lifted the sledgehammer one final time, swung with everything he had, and shattered the remaining concrete. For about half a second, nothing happened. Victor stood in the newly opened space, admiring the room, proud of the open concept he had just created. Then gravity remembered its job. The pillar had been supporting part of the entire floor above him. Without it, the structural load had nowhere to go. The concrete slab overhead didn't sag. It didn't slowly shift. It failed instantly. The upstairs neighbor's living room collapsed straight downward. A massive avalanche of concrete, furniture, and flooring dropped into Victor's brand new open concept space. A couch, a television, bookshelves, hundreds of pounds of reinforced concrete, all arriving at once. Victor never had time to step away. Emergency crews later described the scene as a partial structural collapse, but the building inspector who reviewed the damage summarized the situation much more clearly. Victor had successfully created the most open floor plan imaginable, one where the upstairs apartment now shared the same living room. A very expensive reminder that before you remove a pillar, you should make sure it's not holding up the entire building. Case 10. The Tire Torch Mechanic. There is a universal rule in mechanics that professionals follow without question. Never apply heat to a pressurized tire. Because a tire is not just rubber, it is a high-pressure container filled with compressed air. And when you heat compressed gas inside a sealed space, the pressure rises fast. This basic idea is covered in high school physics under something called Charles's Law, but our final Darwin Award contender had apparently skipped that class. His name was Greg, and Greg was the type of backyard mechanic who believed professional repair shops existed purely to steal money from honest men. Why pay experts when you have tools and confidence? On this particular Sunday afternoon, Greg was dealing with a small problem. The steel rim on his pickup truck had a slight bend. Nothing dramatic, just enough to cause a slow air leak. A professional repair shop would fix this in a very straightforward way. Step 1. Remove the tire. Step 2. Deflate it completely. Step 3. Heat the bare rim and reshape it. But removing the tire would take time, maybe 20 minutes, and Greg had no interest in wasting 20 minutes. So he decided to fix the rim without removing the tire. The tire was still mounted, still inflated, still holding roughly 80 psi of pressure, which is already quite a lot of compressed air. But Greg wasn't thinking about pressure, he was thinking about metal, because steel expands when heated, meaning if he could heat the bent section of the rim, he might be able to straighten it. The plan sounded brilliant, in the kind of way that many terrible ideas sound brilliant for about 30 seconds. Greg walked into the garage and grabbed a propane blowtorch, a powerful one, the kind capable of producing a flame over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. He crouched beside the truck, lit the torch, and began heating the rim. Blue flame roaring, metal slowly turning darker, the tire sitting right next to the heat source. Now, remember what happens when you heat compressed gas. It expands. Inside the tire, the air molecules were getting hotter and moving faster. The internal pressure was rising rapidly. Meanwhile, the rubber sidewall of the tire was also heating up. And rubber does not enjoy extreme heat. It weakens, softens, begins to degrade. Greg noticed a strong burning smell. The rubber was sizzling. Small bubbles began forming in the sidewall. But he ignored it, because the rim was finally glowing a faint cherry red. And that meant the metal was hot enough to reshape. He leaned in closer, torch still blasting the rim, his face only inches away from the tire. Then the tire reached its breaking point. The weakened rubber could no longer contain the rapidly expanding air. The sidewall ruptured, instantly. The result was not just a pop, it was a violent explosion. The compressed air inside the tire released all at once. The heavy steel rim was launched outward with tremendous force, essentially becoming a high-speed projectile. Greg was directly in front of it. The impact was immediate and devastating. Neighbors reported hearing a loud boom that echoed down the street. By the time emergency services arrived, the scene was already quiet. The truck sat in the driveway, one wheel completely destroyed, the rim lying several feet away, still warm from the torch. In the final report, investigators noted something darkly ironic. Greg had been trying to save a $15 tire removal fee. Instead, he accidentally built a device capable of launching a steel wheel like a small cannon. A final reminder of one of the most reliable laws in the universe. Compressed air and open flames do not negotiate. So let's review today's absolutely elite roster of terrible decisions. We had the train surfer who challenged 27,000 volts of electricity, the man who trusted cinder blocks over jack stands, the clothesline engineer who weaponized steel cable, the steel worker who napped inside industrial equipment, the tornado gladiator who tried to fight weather with mattresses, the interior designer who removed the building's spine, and the backyard mechanic who turned a tire into a cannon. 10 different stories, 10 different locations, 10 completely different ways to lose an argument with physics. But every single one shared the same fatal ingredient: absolute confidence. Because the Darwin Awards are not about bad luck. They are about people who stare directly at danger and say, "Relax, I got this." Physics, however, always responds the same way. No, you really don't. Now it's your turn. Which one of these absolute legends deserves the gold medal in catastrophic decision-making? The train surfer? The tornado mattress warrior? Or the guy who turned his pickup tire into a homemade artillery system? Drop your most savage roast in the comments. And if you enjoy watching natural selection work overtime, hit like, subscribe to Mr. Playdumb, and join us for the next episode where we continue documenting humanity's ongoing battle against basic common sense. Until then, stay hydrated, avoid industrial equipment, and maybe let licensed professionals handle anything that involves electricity, explosives, or gravity.